So thanks to everyone for joining us today for this special fireside chat about new technologies potentially impacting marketing. We titled this Will Web3 Disrupt Marketing, but we'll cover all sorts of disruptive marketing aspects that Alexis has seen. As we've mentioned, the world has changed a lot in the last 3 years for all consumers, but also for marketers and for people building and selling marketing technology. So excited to hear from a thought leader on disruptive technologies like Web3 about what we should be thinking about this in the marketer's corner of the world. So thanks again for everyone, to everyone for joining us. I'm Chris Kelly, the founder and CEO of Upwave. Upwave is the analytics platform for brand advertising. And I'm joined today by our friend Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit and the current founder of venture capital firm 776. And I'd say, Alexis, you're a tireless supporter of new technologies and startups. So I don't know if you approve of that label, but it's one I'll put on you nonetheless.
I do, and let's not forget, obviously, also founder of Initialized, which is a proud investor of y'all.
It was, yes. I didn't want to do the shameless plug, but we were proud.
No, I'll do it. I'll do the plug.
Initialized, which you're also the founder of. So I think people are probably pretty familiar with Reddit as one of the largest media properties on the web, but would love to hear you give the quick overview of 776, the VC firm, for those who aren't familiar with what you've been up to the last couple of years.
Sure. I mean, in short, doing venture, but doing it a little differently. I'm a product guy first and foremost. So the North Star is technology company that deploys venture capital. And, we've only been around the last, call it, year and a half, but seen some good success. And I think we're on to something really unique because venture is still one of the last industries standing that has little to no software. Yeah. Which means little to no efficiency, little to no accountability, little to no, et cetera, et cetera. And it's already given us quite an edge just to be building literally an operating system that runs the firm, runs our relationship to our founders and our LPs. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing it. There's also a sister foundation, very creatively named 776 Foundation. And, those two are going to be my focus for the rest of my years. So whether deploying capital for-profit, or deploying capital for not-for-profit, that's what I seem to be pretty good at and I have a lot of fun doing. So we're just trying to do it a little differently with software. And I think you all have seen firsthand the difference that software is making. And I don't think any industry is safe.
Yeah, I think that's right. We see it in marketing analytics, how software can need services and the disruptive change that software can bring to a service-oriented industry. And I agree with the irony you pointed out. VCs, the ultimate service-oriented industry historically, which is ironic because it invests in software companies almost exclusively. So I'm glad you're ending that irony, hopefully. And we wish you and 776 and the 776 Foundation the best of luck. To dive into today's topic, so one of the disruptive technologies that you seem to have an eye on from where you've been investing and where you've been tweeting and where you've been doing media appearances on is this broader trend of Web3 and blockchain technology. So that's what we'll talk about today and hear the latest from that, especially through the lens of how it may impact marketers. So let's start with the basics though, because we may have some marketers, whether they're at a brand or at an agency or even at a media company who joined us today, and they've joined to learn what the heck Web3 even is. So for the uninitiated, can you give the explain it like I'm five version of Web3?
Good Reddit reference. Okay. Well, so Reddit was one of the pillars of Web 2. And I know it's just jargon. I even back when that was a thing would make fun of the Web 2 framing. And it is silly, but it does help simplify. And I do think it is apt because I do think this is a big shift. And the simplest way to explain it would be, so, going from Web 1 to Web 2, the start of social media, was marked by a change of an internet that went from just being read only to read and write. So that is, anyone who visited a website wasn't just reading content from it. You're able to create content on it. And more often the case, the content you were creating was actually more valuable than any content the platform itself was creating. So whether it's uploading a link on Reddit, submitting a photo to Instagram, yada, 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 social media is about read and write. That's Web 2. Web 3 adds a third component. So you have read, you have write, and then you have own. The technology of the blockchain allows for ownership, a proof of ownership digitally that historically we only really have like a physical analog for. Like, this is a one-of-one card. It is in my possession. You can replicate this image all over the internet, but no one's going to pay you, a few $100,000 for it unless it's the actual one. And what we now have, thanks to this technology, is a proof of ownership. And right now, the use cases are pretty simple and pretty basic, but we're starting to see more and more value and utility. And I think for brands in particular, we're going to see a huge shift really in just the next few years, because it's going to change the relationship that individuals have with their communities or their audiences, whether that individual is a celebrity or brand. I know brands aren't human, but there's a relationship there that's going to take on a very different dynamic thanks to this tech. And happy to get into more. I know we have questions from folks about this, but at the high level, it's going to affect a lot of things.
That's
just in the same way Web 2 did.
Yeah. And how ready do you think brands are for this change? So if you rewind a decade and a half, you had the job of convincing advertisers that they should put their brand next to this new thing called user-generated content, which was scary to them. And to some marketers, maybe still is scary. So I imagine they're even more frightened by this new change. And wait a second, I have to think in a world where not just as you said, the read to read write shift, but the read write to read write own shift. So do you have a sense that brand marketers are nervous or hesitant, or are some of them excited for the shift? The way I imagine in your early days of Reddit, some were excited for the shift to social media instead of just broadcast media, and some are ready for
I think very few are excited. I think it shouldn't surprise you that the first adopters have been brands that deeply understand culture and community. So you look at Nike acquiring Artifacts, which is an NFT company. You look at the NBA partnering with Top Shot really to kick off a lot of the NFT stuff a couple of years ago. You look at Adidas partnering with the Bored Apes for a limited drop. Right, I just named 3 very sophisticated marketing companies, and that are actually fairly tech savvy, in a sea of incumbents that set a low bar for tech savviness. But and I think you probably 10 or 15 years ago would have seen those same companies leaning in early to social media because they realized, as disruptive as this was, it's inevitable. Like a lot of technologies that solve problems and have sort of bottom up interest. And but I do think the learning curve here is a lot steeper, because there is a technological, there's that learning curve from the tech side of it, and then frankly there's just a lot of noise. There's probably one of the best things I've lived through, like 3 crypto cycles now. I first seed invested in Coinbase in 2012. And I was in the Ethereum pre-sale personally a few years later. Like I've been in the space for a while. I've seen multiple winters now. And the nice thing is, during these crypto winters, you see a scattering of the charlatans. You see a scattering of the sort of grifters. And the folks who stick around and are building are oftentimes the one actually creating the real technology that's going to hold up and do great stuff. So actually, I do, in many ways, I've been looking forward to is too strong of a word, but I've been relishing another crypto winter like we just had and are in right now, because it just means better stuff is going to get built with more focus on actually solving problems. And that's great. And I do think we're in the simplest manifestation of it right now. I think we're going to start to see more and more examples, and probably, one of the most applicable ones to brands. And I've been having a lot of these conversations with, let's say, incumbent IP holders. So folks who are sitting on a lot of valuable IP that historically have had a pretty good relationship to fan bases and communities, but don't really know how to orient themselves now, even though they know community is more important than ever. And and the opportunity if you're an IP holder is tremendous. Because, you know, every time one of those silly apes resells, Yuga Labs makes money. And we're big investors and early investors in Yuga Labs, the company, the holdco of like Bored Apes and a few of these other projects. This is a company that's going to make a few $100 million in revenue this year, almost all margin, just from the secondary sales of those NFTs. Just from, as long as everyone just wakes up every morning and people are still buying and selling these things, they make a percentage. And that's, there's no fee paid to Visa. You know, that transaction is being handled on the blockchain. So there's this component to it that we've just literally never seen before. Like because that flow of secondary sales never would have existed. And not only does it exist now, it'll exist for all time. Like it can exist in perpetuity as long as the technology is relevant to folks. It'll keep paying out. So that opens up really interesting opportunities. And probably one of the simplest things that we can now prove is, you know, if you think about even when I think of just NFTs as a technology, I try to equate it to like paper, where, you know, as an analog thing, paper has clearly, it's done some amazing stuff. But if you were to go back in time to the earliest days of paper, and you were explaining to some dude in Egypt messing around with some papyrus that one day this could be used for a constitution that would be priceless and help be a founding document for a country, and also be a like business card that people would use to introduce themselves, and also be a trading card that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars just because of the person that's printed on it. Or it could be a ticket stub that, if it's to the right event, could be worth $2 the day you bought it, or it could be worth $500,000 when it's sold at auction, like the Michael Jordan debut ticket was just a few months ago. And like trying to explain all the layers of that. And this paper can also be used for toilet paper, and it's utterly worthless. I mean, it's really valuable, but no one's paying for it after use, right? Like think about that, and all the ways the paper is used. And the vast majority of what gets produced is actually pretty worthless. Right? It's not priceless. And that doesn't make the technology bad. It just means it served a different utility. And we don't throw out, we don't discard paper as a technology simply because there are lots of frivolous use cases for it. So we're still at the stage where we've really just now given basically a canvas to artists to create art. Maybe it's a one-of-one photo that they can now prove that like they made. It's one of one, and every time it sells for all time, they make some money. And so, you know, I have friends who are photographers whose lives have been changed now because they make a living on their art, and they never did ever before. That's powerful. But now, you know, you talk about it like a marketer. Let's talk about like brand marketers. You know, a company like, I don't know, Disney is trying really hard to get me to, I mean, they'll never have to worry about me unsubscribing from Disney Plus as long as I have a child in my house. But, you know, they want to get more and more people signed up for it. They want to get more and more people in theaters. Historically, you've never had a way to segment your audience really intelligently. You could do all the things Facebook and others could offer you, but you didn't actually know who are your real biggest fans. You could come up with proxies and say, okay, well, this person's been, you know, they created the Encanto fan group, and they were the first one, but it was all kind of made up. If you think of NFTs as a way to create a proxy for fandom, right? There will come a time when you'll be able to get a ticket. And again, you won't as a user know or care that it's an NFT, but it will be. You'll get a ticket for an early screening of a trailer to a new show on Disney Plus. You'll get to watch that trailer 48 hours before it drops on YouTube, maybe 24 hours, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just some amount of time before. And, you know, you can imagine a scenario where one, Disney is not only able to now charge money for a thing they normally wouldn't have been able to charge money for, because now they can say the only way you can view this thing is if you're logging into an NFT gated website. So you have to have that NFT, you have to be able to log in and use it. But then you can imagine a scenario where you create a market where, let's say you sell 100 of those tickets or 1,000 N of those tickets, and you do it a month in advance. And for the next month, you now have the market forces let people who can wait a couple extra days sell that ticket again digitally to anyone in the world, and maybe make a few bucks. But remember, Disney or the publisher also makes money on every one of those secondary transactions. And so now you've created value where there's always been value in your community, because you're actually able to have supply meet demand. And then over time, you now know, you now have a relationship with people who hold that ticket stub digitally. And so, and again, like basically each one of those ticket stubs sits in it's tied to an ETH address, or you could think of it as like a mailbox.
Yeah.
And so then a marketer could say, let me send a message. This technology doesn't quite exist. XMTP is one company that I think is going to probably get there first. But let me send a message to everyone who has one of these ticket stubs, or has held this ticket stub for more than 3 weeks, or who got this ticket stub in the original drop, or who got this ticket stub and paid more than $10 for it. Like you can message through all of those criteria, because all of that data is on a public ledger. And now you can start targeting your messaging in a way that actually really hits, it hits at a communal level, it hits at a fandom level you've never really been able to properly measure before. And that is literally the dumbest first idea that I could have come up with, right? No one has actually had the moment where they're like, hey, we could write something down and it's a constitution, or we could write this down. We could claim that this is a current, like the use cases for it are still so like almost prehistoric right now. Yeah. Creativity is going to spur so much more interesting stuff.
Yeah. So we're still in the papyrus days, not the Michael Jordan first game.
Exactly.
But yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
But also just think about explaining that, right? Like,
yeah, I love that.
All of the infrastructure, let's use tickets as an example. All of the infrastructure that exists. Imagine you're in 3000 BCE, I don't know, Egypt. And you're like, look, we're going to have you're explaining organized sport and then professional sports. And then you're like, look, and everyone's going to have a piece of paper that just has written on it, here is your seat and the date and the time. And everyone is just going to agree to show up at that place, to sit in the seat they're supposed to sit in. And naturally, someone's reaction back then, I assume, would have been like, well, that's never going to work, because how are people going to agree? Like, I could just make my own fake ticket and show up and say, oh, I'm in seat 6, right? And it's like, yes, that happened. It still happens. It's getting harder and harder as the technology improves. But it would seem borderline preposterous to someone at the like birth time of paper that this could even just work, let alone that ticket 30 years later, because of how special that moment was, ends up being worth 100,000 times more.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're at that stage where it is going to take, there's so much more creativity to come and so much more building that needs to come to actually prove this stuff out. But I feel pretty confident it's going in that direction.
Yeah. Interesting. You mentioned in the ticketing example, we did have to build on top of paper tickets certain anti-fraud techniques, right? We had think of the special ink. Think of the all the different small things we did and what we do with barcodes to try to make it versus just writing ticket number 6. And I imagine part of your vision is that some of these technologies that can be baked in at a much more sophisticated version into the blockchain, into NFTs. So that's really interesting. So how, if you mentioned earlier that there's still a lot of noise, and that you mentioned in a few ways it's hard to even know where to begin. So I'll pivot to questions from attendees. So thanks to all of our attendees who submitted these questions. So how would you pick the number one important thing for a senior advertising executive to know about Web3 or act on? So if you get 20 minutes with a CMO and they say, I can do one thing in 2022 that helps me enter the Web3 era. Is it NFTs? Is it doing something else on the blockchain? What one thing would you point them to if they had to make an impact, if they had to show their board in 2022, I'm doing something?
Yeah, it really depends on the brand. And so that, look, it's going to limit, I'll just rattle off some examples, right? There are if your business relies on the sort of like in-store proof of purchase, like every time you buy a burrito, I'll stamp the card for you and until you get a free burrito. Like that is a clear and like pretty obvious and being built like Web3 use case.
Yeah.
If you are if you are sophisticated with culture and community, and you probably should be self-aware enough to know if you are or you aren't one of those brands, right? No one's going to be like, Adidas, you don't know anything about culture and community, right? Like if you are one of those brands, I would say look for partnerships with some of the blue chip projects. There was one that just launched it was Invisible Friends, which is the NFT project designed, I forget the artist's name, but they just announced a partnership with Kith. So, top streetwear brand, right? This is it makes sense within the culture and it's like, it's sort of good. It's 1 + 1 = 3 type of partnership. And, you've seen others with like some of the luxury brands doing things in these spaces. It just has to make sense. It has to vibe. I don't know how else to describe it with folks who are, actively spending their time on Web3. And then look, if it's a business where maybe none of those things apply, it is okay to not have a strategy for it, or at least not have a thing to do right now with it. Because a lot of the tools to make it obvious, like, don't exist yet, right? There's no Instagram yet. There's no Twitter yet where I can say like, oh yeah, look, there's billions of people here who want to get to know your brand, want to be a part of it. Like it is not worth trying to make fetch happen here if it's not obvious. But there's some low hanging fruit for different types of businesses right now, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And I'm sure we'll see more and more low hanging fruit every year, if not every month.
And they're welcome, whether they're emailing you and you forward it to me, or you can try Twitter DMing me or something. Like, I'm happy if you want to just be like, oh, I am the CMO of blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm happy to throw some feedback.
I'm sure some attendees will take you up on that. So if you're a marketer, maybe to get a quick DM exchange with Alexis on how your brand can take advantage of Web3 technologies, hit me up or
email Chris and forward it. Well,
yeah, I'll filter out the spam for you. I'll be your inbound SDR.
No, I'm just saying. I mean, you're the point person here.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. And speaking of the education piece, another crowd submitted question was how we think about educating brands because there's so much noise. You talked about if you were sitting down with a CMO, but from a broader education standpoint, what else is out there? Do we need to be teaching about these things in business schools? Do we need to be putting on, does the IAB need to be putting on webinars? What kind of systemic things do you think, if anything, is needed to change the education? Because you mentioned the learning curve is much steeper than it was for Web2. It wasn't that hard for you to wrap your head around read versus write. So yeah, any ideas for that of kind of systemic educational changes?
Gosh, this one's going to be hard. It is evolving so quickly. I don't know if you could institutionalize it. There are a lot of great bottom-up resources. I mean, at the end of the day, look, all the things I know and have learned about the space have come from, so talking to builders in it, which that's I sort of have an unfair advantage there. But a lot of it is just from the zeitgeist. It's from Twitter. It's from Discord. It's from spending time. And the other really interesting about this is culturally, so much about all of Web3 is about building in public, in part because it's more often than not on chains, like literally in public in a public database. But culturally, that's also the vibe. And so for a lot of folks, it's really up to you. Like, if you want to seek out this information, if you want to make time for it, it is actually there and available in a bottom-up manner. Now, would it benefit to have some like more kind of top-down produced content? Yeah, maybe it could be a good thing for us, for 776 to be doing. But it's wild because some of the best sort of experts I know in the space are folks who just have, they're earlier in their careers, and they also just have more bandwidth and more time and more hunger, and they're thriving because they can find these resources, they can connect with one another and win, because that's really the greatest barrier more often than not.
Yeah, no, That's helpful to hear. So appreciate that commentary. And getting to a couple more crowdsourced questions while we have the time. So someone wanted to hear about some color commentary from you on the futures of NFTs, and I guess in anything that is coming up as potential negative impact of them. The environmental impact was one thing they noted, the downturn in value, another thing that I guess could be a risk for a consumer. So how do you think of that?
Oh, yeah.
Have you know anyone addressing the environmental impact of NFTs, or anyone addressing the, I guess like you have in any market, like in baseball cards, they can go up, they can go down, they can be worth a lot one day, they can crash the next day. Any commentary on that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the latter, you bring up baseball cards. As I'm still looking. I'm deep in the collectible space. As far as I can see, even right now, trading cards are still pretty uncorrelated with anything like stock market, gold, Bitcoin. Like trading cards just don't care. Like it's insane to see. But point still taken on NFTs, which obviously I think even the blue chips have held up their value pretty well, but the rest of the market absolutely tanked as it should have. A lot of us were saying that for quite some time. It was inevitable. I would say for a brand, in most cases, again, it depends on the brand, but I think in 90% of brand cases, NFTs are not a way to create a speculative asset for your fans. Yeah, if you're Kith, that's already implicit in streetwear culture. That's why people line up to get drops, because they know they can resell it for more in the secondary market. Okay, yeah, there's some brands where, and again, this is a sort of self-awareness test. If you're not one of those brands, then the goal should not be create a speculative asset. The goal should be for utility. And so, again, this is going to vary based on the different companies, but it's not about creating something that someone is going to flip or hold on to retire one day. And that goes into the messaging, that goes into the pricing, that goes in everything. It's about the utility of, right? Like, here is that ticket that helps you get into the private access live stream. There's a company called Antic that's building this tech. And so I've watched it and I've been like, oh, holy shit. Like that's actually useful. There's some useful utility there. Or if it's for the punch cards, for the free burrito, again, it's not, it is not about creating something you're going to retire from. It's just creating a delightful user experience, and one where, I don't know, if it works one day, and you have a ton of burritos, but you're really in the mood for a free falafel, you can imagine trading it with some stranger on the internet to get that free falafel for a burrito that you don't want. It's that. Again, this stuff seems kind of silly, but
more liquidity in the secondary.
But if you're creating a great user experience, and why the hell not? Sure. I mean, again, there's an offline version of that where you're at the cubicle, you're at the office, and your buddy is like, oh man, I've got a free falafel today. And you're like, oh, I've got a free burrito. Actually, let's just trade. Let me give you mine. You give me yours, because I want a falafel today. Ta-da. Like that. It seems so moot. But when you create the user experience of a delightful app and a seamless, oh, cool, I get the benefit of all the free burritos I want, and then the day I want a falafel, I actually get a free falafel too. And neither of those companies you don't need to be one big monolith to make that happen. It could just be two totally different businesses. Yeah. And then with regard to the environment, so different blockchains have different environmental impacts, sort of in the same way that I don't know, the environmental impact of a Tesla is very different from the environmental impact of a semi truck. And so, Ethereum is the most prominent platform right now for NFTs. It is still pretty inefficient. A few of the projects, let's say Kevin Rose's Proof project, they offset all of the fees, all the sort of environmental costs of the minting process. That's what the most forward-thinking projects are doing. But there's a big technological improvement that everyone's been looking forward to that's going to shift Ethereum from a proof of work to a proof of stake. And so it'll significantly cut the environmental impact of making the Ethereum blockchain work. Hasn't happened yet. We're optimistic it's going to happen this year. And then there are other chains like a layer 2. without getting too jargony, there are a couple of other options for NFTs right now, like Polygon or Solana. Both of those have little to no environmental impact whatsoever, just because of the way they were built. Was they're sort of more like building a Tesla than building a semi. They knew from the start that was one of the goals they wanted to achieve, and so that's
they were solving for that. Interesting. Yes. So they're solving to minimize impact. That's great. That's great to hear. So last question. Now we're at time. We'll sneak in one more, then we'll let everyone break. So I guess an abstract question. So I'll let you take in any direction you want. So what do you think is something that the conventional wisdom is wrong about right now that we'll look back in 3 years and laugh at the 2022 conversations about the portfolio of Web3 and crypto technologies? Is there something that's the next big thing that you're excited about that no one else is yet excited about? Or is there conversely something that everyone's focused on and you think that's not yet interesting, that's not actually that interesting?
Yeah, the thing that gets the headlines right now is the record sales of these PFP projects, profile picture projects like Bored Apes, Punks. You've probably seen a few of these headlines. I think that is it's misplaced. And even looking at, folks have reported on the decline in transactions of NFTs. I've seen NFTs reported dead a lot over the last 6 months, but especially again, even the last month. And that is a much less interesting statistic. That is a reflection of the thing I was talking about earlier that I'm excited about, which is an exodus of the charlatans and the folks who just want to make some money, flipping some JPEGs. What's really interesting is the developer activity. And I think Alex from OpenSea tweeted this earlier today about, if you look at the smart contract deployers per day around NFTs, it has continued, especially in Ethereum, but also in Matic, which is Polygon. It's just continued to grow, especially in the last week. And so what does that say? That says developers, that is like people smarter than me, who are deciding where they want to spend their very valuable time, not just for the next week, but for years to come, are shipping even more right now to improve upon this technology. And so I always follow the builders. I've found a lot of success in my career as a founder, as CEO, as well as just an early investor, looking to where really smart builders are willing to put their time where they see opportunity. Because with technology, that tends to be a leading indicator of where dope things are going. Because those builders focusing their time and their energy tend to build dope things. Those dope things tend to attract the rest of us who are like, oh, that's dope. I'm glad this exists now. and you could think about, just think of the glut of iPhone apps on the App Store when it first launched that just made everyone so offended, right? Like the Rich app, that one really expensive app that just showed you were rich, or like, I don't know, the button, like the Whoopee Cushion app, or these apps that would make people, they would get headlines and everyone would be so pissed and they'd be like, God, this is so pathetic, like wasting all their time doing blah, blah, blah. And it's like, fine. But what was happening there, the bigger, more interesting thing, was this brand new technology, smartphones, was actually attracting a pool of developers who saw opportunities to build what are now world-changing technologies that we take for granted, right? Like, because we created an environment that made it really easy for some jerk to make an I'm Rich app, also allowed us to now summon a car literally anywhere in the world. Those are the same, that's the same technology. It's the same app store. And yes, that opened the floodgates to a bunch of bullshit, but look at 10 years out, 15 years out with that perspective, like, oh my God, this just changed our world in so many different ways. And that's just one example. And so I feel similarly here. And if I would be so much more concerned if there weren't so many smart, earnest builders just shipping and building and saying they're going to devote a ton of time to this space. And it's not the only one. Don't get me wrong. I invest in rocket companies. We invest in marketing companies and advertising companies. We're looking at a lot of different places, but what's very clear is this underlying tech of Web3 is going to be a part of a lot of things.
Yeah. I like the slogan you mentioned, follow the builders. I think that's a good
Yeah.
takeaway for our audience. If nothing else, follow the builders. They will let you live in the future. They'll tell you where you should be spending your energy. So appreciate that and appreciate all your time. I know we ran over, so we'll let you drop and let our audience drop. But as Alexis mentioned, feel free to follow up on Twitter. I'm at Chris Kelly on Twitter. Alexis is at Alexis Ohanian. So we'll promote a Web2 technology Twitter.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm an active.
And if you're building the Web3 of Twitter, then ping Alexis.
Definitely.
We'll invest.
For it.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Alexis, for your time. I know we only scratched the surface of a large conversation. So I'm sure we'll be talking about it for years to come. So thanks for hopping on. And
anytime, Chris.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.